Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. I'm Nick Park. I'm taking us through some 5-minute teachings on the translation and transmission of the Bible. How everything that began back in the Old Testament and with the Jews and with Jesus ended up in our hands as the Word of God in our own languages that we're able to read and is readily accessible to all of us. And we're looking at how God has been in control and overruling history to bring this whole process to pass. And last week we were talking about the Irish Church, about how they copied the Bible and really, in the midst of the Dark Ages, preserved both the scriptures and civilization. And we talked about John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, and soon we'll be talking about some other great Bible translators. But today we're talking about somebody who was neither a translator nor a theologian, and yet he is one of the key figures in the translation and transmission of the Word of God. Johannes Gutenberg was, well, to be honest, he was a bit of a chancer. He was a guy who understood how things worked. He was a bit of a handyman, and he made money where he could. So he went around doing odd jobs and doing money-making schemes in different places. He actually got run out of one city because he was selling magic mirrors that could collect holy light from church relics. He claimed that if you bought one of his mirrors, when you went to look at, I don't know, some saint's finger in a monastery or something, the holy light that would come from the relic would be captured by your mirror and you could bask in that holy light in your home. Of course, it was a load of junk, but he was making money like any con man does. Now, he also experimented with printing. And at that time, printing had been invented, but it was very slow and very laborious because in Korea, they had actually developed a method of printing close to what Gutenberg would also invent, but nobody in Europe knew what was going on in Korea. But in Europe, if you wanted to print something, you had to do it by woodcuts, which is where you would get a piece of wood and you would basically cut into that wood pictures or letters, and then you would put ink across the face of the piece of wood and you'd press it against a bit of paper. Now, as you can imagine, that would take an awful long time. It would take days and days just to have one small picture or a few sentences together. And so printing did exist, but not in any shape or form that enabled you to produce a lot of stuff. Certainly not enough to print books. And Gutenberg came up with something called movable type, which until everything became digitalized a few years ago was the basis for all printing right up to the end of the 20th century. And basically movable type meant this, that you produced the letters on little squares and you set them in lines, and by rearranging them you could make all the different words. And so it meant you didn't have to carve all these wooden things for each page. You just rearranged the letters that you had got and they all stayed in place, and then you covered them with ink and pressed it against a sheet of paper. Quite a simple idea, but incredibly revolutionary, and it just changed the world totally. In fact, historians say that perhaps the biggest and most life-changing inventions that have ever been made in history, there would be the wheel, there would be the printing press, there would be the steam engine, there would be electricity, there'd be the microchip. These kinds of inventions that changed the world forever, so it never went back to the way it was before. And Gutenberg invented the printing press, movable type. And in 1455, he printed his first book. And what was the book that was going to be most popular? It was the Bible, Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible. And today there are still, from that original printing, there's still 48 of what's called the Gutenberg Bibles that are still in existence. There's still museums in the world where you can go and see a Gutenberg Bible, the first properly printed book in the world. And it was the Bible. And it had no page numbers, it had no paragraph breaks, so it would be hard to read. It took about half a day to set up the type for each page. But nevertheless, once you'd set those pages up, you could print thousands and thousands of copies. And this was just in time for the Reformation and for people producing translations into different languages of the Word of God. It was like God's perfect timing. And you see, even though Gutenberg was in no way a Christian leader or an evangelist or anything else. God used him because God uses technology. And the church, in spreading the gospel and in getting the word of God out to as many people as possible, has always utilized the latest methods of technology and still is doing so today. So even though he was no saint, we can still thank God for Johannes Gutenberg and the invention that he came up with. This conman and chancer came up with this great invention that it eventually was going to enable the word of God to go to millions and millions of people. And so we can thank God for that as well. God bless you today. Join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.